My name is Clive Driscoll. I was the senior investigating officer into the murder of Mr. Stephen Lawrence. Whenever I come back, I always feel extremely sad. This was a young man who'd done absolutely nothing wrong. I don't think Stephen would have even remotely understood what was just about to happen to him. And in a very cowardly attack, incredibly cowardly attack, lost his life.
The emotions and trauma 25 years on is still there because of the way that he was butchered, and butchered because he was black.
I've always felt with the family that we'd actually let them down. And I just felt, looking at Stephen, that maybe I might just be able to give them, I can't give them Stephen back, but to give them something, to get some justice for them.
I didn't set out to make a difference. We were pushed into the limelight. I didn't have a choice. The end game was always to get justice, to make sure those individuals who murdered my son went to prison.
Teenagers accused of murdering the black schoolboy Stephen Lawrence have been released from custody.
The parents of Stephen Lawrence today failed in their attempt to bring a private prosecution against young men they believed murdered their son.
The inquiry, headed by Sir William Macpherson, will look at the way the criminal justice system handles racially motivated crime.
Here was a family who suffered twice. It's the first time, absolutely devastating to hear that your son has been brutally murdered, as Stephen was. But then to find that the very group of people who you should be able to trust haven't done the job that you'd expected them to do, and you worry about why it is that they haven't done that job.
The Macpherson report examines in detail the murder of Stephen Lawrence and its aftermath. It's a chronicle of extraordinary incompetence and ineptitude by the Metropolitan Police. More than that, it's a shaming account of what Sir William Macpherson refers to as institutionalized racism in the police and by inference more generally in our society.
The acknowledgement that that report gave made me at least feel hopeful for our future and the greater good. It was a moment of idealism that I allowed myself to have.
The Stephen Lawrence inquiry has defined my generation of policing. I can't think of a more impactful public inquiry. And if I speak personally, I can't think of a case which has changed the way I think about policing and doing our job well as much as this one.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, the report into the murder of Stephen Lawrence raised profound issues for our multiracial society. A bill will be introduced which will make it unlawful for public bodies to racially discriminate.
Even though that was a good thing, my son's killers are still walking the street. That didn't do anything to put them behind bars.
My name's Mark Daly. I'm a BBC journalist, and I've been associated with the Stephen Lawrence case for 15 years. After the Daily Mail front page, after Macpherson, the world knew, or thought they knew, who was responsible for the murder of Stephen Lawrence. And I guess that must have been partly what drove them to agree to appear on national television.
Tonight, exclusive interviews with the murder suspects in the Stephen Lawrence case.
We're seen in the public eye as murderers, big-time gangsters, just killers. We're looked upon as scum.
You didn't threaten a woman with a lump of wood. You didn't attack Sean Kalitzi with a kosh. You didn't own the monkey wrench. I mean, come on. Those are three separate incidents of your period as a schoolboy.
And these are all things that have been twisted to make me look like the bad guy.
Did your friends use knives?
No.
You're absolutely sure?
I'm not sure, no, but in my opinion, they didn't carry knives.
Both Jamie and Neil have told us that they did carry knives before the murder of Stephen Lawrence.
I didn't know that, Martin. I didn't know that.
2 anonymous notes were found, and your name is at the top of both.
Right.
It says in one of them that you and David Norris are the ringleaders. It says you in particular were definitely seen in the area of the murder. It says that you and your brother, quotes, always carry knives and threaten people. Your group are described as very dangerous. When did you first hear that there had been a murder?
I think it might have been the next day. On the nose, I think.
You said that your brother was in the house when this individual came and informed you that there had been an attack.
As far as I can remember, yes.
Yeah. He says the first he heard of the attack was the following day on television.
It was a extremely brazen move, and they came across poorly.
We've got 3 different stories here as to what happened. What was going on that night? Why can't you all agree with what was happening?
Because maybe we ain't too 100% sure. It's not, like I say, it was to us, it was a normal weekday night.
But your stories don't tally.
We don't remember every night what you do, exactly what you do,
But
what
that was the most
conversations you
important night of your life.
said. Now I know that.
I was asked to investigate institutional racism in the police, and the starting point for this project was the Stephen Lawrence case. It was the McPherson report, and would you like to go undercover into the Greater Manchester Police? From that time on, I started to steep myself in the happenings of the Stephen Lawrence murder. To my complete shock, the worst racism we encountered was in the training school. One evening I was in my room, sharing a beer with my colleague, who was the most racist of all the officers that I encountered.
Stephen Lawrence killed yesterday. What are your thoughts on that? Isn't it good how good memories don't fade? He fucking deserved it, and his mum and dad are a fucking pair of sponges. And they're fucking seen a good opportunity and sponged it for everything they can get their hands on, including their MBE.
I just couldn't believe that a police officer, someone who was going to be on the beat with powers of arrest, CS spray and handcuffs, held those views. What was he doing in the police?
When I saw the film, I could not believe that these were young recruits coming in, and they already had those attitudes of what they're going to do to black people, to Asian people, whatever they're going to do. You know, it was unbelievable.
I was constantly stopped, searched, beaten up, put in a cell, released, stopped, searched, beaten up, put in a cell.
It is not the case that 100% of white Britons in this country are racist. That's not the case. But it only takes a smallish number to be so and to create real problems. And it only takes an even smaller number in positions of power not to want to do anything to create even bigger problems.
What do you think about the boys that done it? They fucking need fucking diplomatic immunity, right? They are done for this country what others fucking should do. McPherson report. I remember it as if it was yesterday. That's fucking kicking the bollocks for any white man, that was.
What I found was a police force on the surface trying to put its house in order and failing appallingly.
Last year, a Home Office report confirmed that words like coon and nigger were part of police culture. They were used, it said, as a sign of group solidarity.
Believe me, we've got nothing against the older police when they're not causing no trouble whatsoever. It's those little young silly CID men.
I do remember an incident where a female officer said to a lady who was pregnant with a Jamaican father, "How do you feel about having a monkey inside of you?" So I'm not going to sit here and say to you that she was sacked, but I'm not going to say to you everything was right.
Between 1965 and 2000, the police were exempt from the Race Relations Act. The police had impunity to discriminate in the use of their powers. So the Lawrence Inquiry recommendation, the full force of the Race Relations Act, should apply to the police service. I mean, that was long overdue.
If a police officer calls a black man a nigger, shouldn't he be dismissed?
No. No, indeed not. Like everything else, why should he be dismissed for calling him a nigger?
Because it's a term of abuse.
That's a matter of opinion.
The police have placed a permanent guard on the memorial to the murdered teenager in Eltham's Wellhall Road to prevent further attacks by racist vandals. There's clearly been embarrassment at the revelation that a security camera above the plaque is in fact a dummy.
McPherson propelled the Met to reinvestigate with vigour, which they did with a £6 million investigation by John Grieve in Operation Athena. And I think they threw everything they had at that investigation.
It was a team that was so driven to try to bring people to justice, who did an extremely thorough and diligent job. We took the case to the CPS and the decision was made that there was insufficient evidence at that time to prosecute.
We are very aware of who the suspects are, and the suspects are aware of who they are. We're aware of Neville and Dorian's agony, and we're very sorry about it, but there comes a point where a decision has to be made, and we, the Met, have to live with that decision.
We had a meeting with the CPS. Rather than talk to me, they gave me a letter for me to read in this meeting. And the letter was trying to tell me that they've looked at the case and there's nothing more that could happen around Stephen's case.
It's understood Mrs. Lawrence walked out of the meeting in disgust, with her lawyer later issuing a statement on her behalf.
The failure of the police to properly investigate in 1993 has directly led us to the position we are in today. Although the decision is not in my favour, I will not abandon the fight for justice in my son's name.
This was clearly a huge disappointment to them. I can't put myself in their shoes, but it was very hard when the decision came from the Crown Prosecution Service.
It takes huge courage for an individual to continue, to keep going, to say, despite all the rebuffs, no, there's something here, we've got to get to the bottom of it. Doreen is a woman of immense integrity and I think hugely inspirational to others because of the way that she carried on.
After all that had happened, Neville and I were divorced. Neville was angry with me because I think he wanted the marriage to look on the outside is fine. But for me, that would be a lie. I just couldn't live like that anymore. And I didn't want to.
Being back in Jamaica here has helped me a lot. I don't concentrate on the tragedy as much as when I'm there. At one stage, I couldn't drive down the road where it happened. There were so many reminders about the racist murder of Stephen. I can picture Stephen lying on that ground there. It's painful. I wasn't there to help him.
The most far-reaching change to criminal law for nearly 800 years could soon be brought in. It's the scrapping of the double jeopardy rule that means a suspect can't be tried for the same crime twice.
It was Sir William Macpherson's report into the Stephen Lawrence inquiry which first recommended scrapping the double jeopardy rule, which prevents the three men acquitted by a judge at the Old Bailey from ever standing trial again. Today's report by the Law Commission says that in such cases a retrial should be possible, but only if there is reliable and compelling new evidence.
Not being tried twice for the same offence is a fundamental element of rights in any kind of civilised society. But there will be some circumstances in which the double jeopardy rule causes injustice, and those circumstances are where evidence becomes available at a later date, which either was not or could not have been available at the date of the original trial.
I think when the double jeopardy law was changed, I didn't think it would really help us because of lack of evidence.
The police had failed at that point, and there were a few journalists who were prepared to have a bash, and that's what we did. We gave it a bash. When I was going door to door in Eltham chasing various leads. I met some extraordinarily brave people, and I met some extraordinarily scared people. And despite it being 12, 13 years since the murder, it was still very, very raw. And somehow there was still a sense of fear within Eltham, fear of retribution, fear of speaking out against these men, because they still had a reputation for violence. They had a reputation for retribution.
The police said that witnesses lived in fear of your family, and officers were aware, police officers were aware of threats coming from Clifford Norris, which were discouraging witnesses.
Well, I'd like to know where the proof of that is, mate.
Clifford Norris was a high-level drug dealer. Clifford had a fearsome reputation. He once shot a woman in the throat because she told tales about him.
David Norris is a suspect in the murder. Clifford Norris is the father. David Norris is not arrested for 2 weeks. He's not even at home when the police go round.
In every investigation, you will find elements of incompetence. But I think in this one, there was so much that was overlooked, which was part of the argument I put forward to Macpherson for collusion.
I think it's right to say, had that run smoothly, as you'd have expected, I think arrests would have been made quicker. The Macpherson inquiry is very critical of the first 14 days.
It became more difficult to believe that this had been incompetence. I started to think, there's something bigger going on here.
As the police authority for London, and also as Home Secretary, I was the final court of appeal for police discipline cases. And that meant that I had a window on the actuality of police corruption, and there were some staggeringly corrupt police officers around at that stage. Corruption inside the Metropolitan Police Service and quite a number of other big police services had been endemic in parts of their CIDs.
The death of Stephen Lawrence and the failure of the Metropolitan Police to bring anyone to justice for it was one of the most scandalous events in recent criminal history. The young men who were the chief suspects in the case remain at large, and tomorrow a BBC documentary will not only disclose what's become of them, but also why, perhaps, the police investigation was so inadequate.
It was when I met Neil Putnam that our investigation took a slightly different turn, and we started to go after the corruption allegations with the vicar. In 1994, a year after Stephen Lawrence's murder, Neil Putnam was assigned to the South East Regional Crime Squad. On arriving, he says he became embroiled in a world of corruption with a number of officers, which included John Davidson. Now, John Davidson was an integral part of Operation Fishpool, the first investigation into the murder. He was seconded onto it within 36 hours of Stephen being killed.
This interview has been tape recorded. I am Detective Sergeant Davison. I am interviewing Gary George Dobson.
Now, within a very short time, they had become embroiled in a number of different corrupt jobs, which came to the attention of CIB3, the anti-corruption unit, and Putnam was arrested. Almost immediately, Putnam rolled over and became an informant. And he would be at the centre of a huge anti-corruption operation, which involved him giving evidence against half a dozen officers, 5 of whom would go on to be convicted on the back of Neil Putnam's evidence. By the time I saw him, he had been released from prison. He was happy to speak to me, and he was able to put more flesh on the bones about what he thought went on. And what he thought went on in the Lawrence case was corruption. He thought the Stephen Lawrence investigation had been hampered by a corrupt detective. That corrupt detective was John Davidson.
Davidson told me he was looking after Norris. That to me meant that he was protecting him. He was protecting his family against arrests and any conviction.
So you're telling me that a key detective in the first Lawrence investigation was corrupt and in the pocket of Clifford Norris, the father of one of the suspects?
John Davidson told me, looking after Clifford Norris, he was having a nice little earner out of it. And by a nice little earner, I knew from my years in the police service, and especially on the corrupt side of it, a nice little learner meant you were receiving corrupt payment.
We've always suspected stuff about Davison. He was somebody I didn't trust back in the day. And then the rumours about him and the Norris family. Corruption was part of the big thing for us within the inquiry, but nothing came of it.
John Davison denied any wrongdoing, and the Independent Police Complaints Commission launched an investigation, which, after a year or so, concluded that there were no grounds for the allegations the BBC had made. Basically, the IPCC said that the BBC had got it wrong, that the journalism had been sensationalist and irresponsible.
With my mother, I used to watch a gentleman called George Dixon the Doc Green, and I've always felt that that particular programme portrayed the police as very dependable, very reliable, someone who actually wanted to help members of the public in a fair and balanced way.
All correct, George. Good.
I always felt that that's what I'd like to be. I had from an incredibly early age, I wanted to be a police officer because of what I thought the police were and should be, and I wanted to be part of that, really.
My first impression of Clive is just that he's another police officer that I have to deal with. I don't have to like you. Whatever it is that you're doing, it's your job. You just need to get on with it.
He came across as an incredibly strange individual who referred to you as sir and ma'am. He was so old-fashioned in his approach that I thought he was a throwback to the bad old days. And I was wrong.
Yeah, we've got a decision to make today. I can either be Dick Van Dyke, if you want me to be. Here we go. As I live and breathe, Mary Poppins. Or my personal favourite, Sherlock. Sherlock it is. We'd sold Deptford Police Station to a developer, and I was asked to go over to make sure that there was nothing left in that police station that could embarrass the Metropolitan Police Service. And when I went over there, there was a room with probably hundreds of boxes, Operation Fishpool, which is actually the murder of Stephen Lawrence. And I remember saying, well, what are we going to do with all of these boxes?
Will I be handsome? Will I be rich?
And I remember at the time the superintendent, he said, bin them. And I said, well, someone's got to deal with them.
Whatever will be.
And eventually I spoke to the now commissioner, but then Commander Dick, Cressida Dick, and said to her, well, I will take that on. And so I took over Stephen on the 20th of June 2006.
Well, maybe it's because I'm a Londoner that I love London so.
He seemed thoroughly determined to do what he could on this case, and I think one of the things that Clive Driscoll is very good at is winning your trust, and he won the trust of a lot of people, and he had to.
Maybe it's because I'm a Londoner that I love London town.
Cressida Dick told me to watch a presentation that had been prepared by the Racial and Violent Crime Task Force, and someone had spent an awful lot of time putting together where the witnesses were. It was like a pathway to what had happened on the night in April 1993. There was a part of the presentation which said that Mrs. Lawrence had said we couldn't see Stephen's school records. Well, Jim Mould, who was my old DI, best bit of advice anyone's ever given me was, yeah, listen, Clive, but read all the statements. That's what evidence is. That's what the court get. You know, that's what people base cross-examinations on. So read the statements. And I think it was about the third statement I read was Mrs. Lawrence giving us permission to see the school records.
Everything they've asked me for, I've always given. I've never held anything back from the police. These are school photos. I didn't even remember about the school record because I know had they asked me, it would have been yes.
They said, you know, you've got to be careful because she might be critical of you. And I remember saying, well, she's got every right. She's mum. She lost her son, for God's sake, you know. So at that point, I thought, well, if I can't rely on what I'd been told, then I've got to double-check everything. I used to go down Wellhall Road and I used to read the statement and I'd walk the same way that witness may have walked, or I would walk around the houses where that witness may have walked. Certainly one of the most useful things was when I walked with Mr. Brooks. He was there, wasn't he?
One day I met Clive and we were speaking about the scene, and I was describing the scene to him and I was describing the tree, and he was like, Dwayne, what tree? I don't know what you're talking about. So I said, what do you mean, Clive? He goes, well, I've been to the scene and I can't see this tree. Well, what do you mean, Clive? I was confused. So I said, the best thing is that we go down there together so I can describe it all to you. So when I go to the scene now, I can see all the changes that have been made. So I point out to him how the road was, because the road, how it is today, isn't how it was in 1993. The junction is completely different. And so where the tree would be and where the layout of the road would be is completely different. So I pointed that all out to him and then said, Clive, you need to go and look at the pictures that were taken. So he goes back and looks at the pictures, and then that cleared up something important for him, but he didn't tell me what it was.
There's a bus coming. Can you see it coming?
Whilst checking all of the statements together, we found out it wasn't a brief attack or anything like it. It could have been as long as 45 seconds to 50 seconds. But if you're getting whacked, 50 seconds is a very long time. And when I lecture, I will do what barristers do. You'll hate me for it. I'll stop talking for 50 seconds. I won't, but 50 seconds is quite a length of time, actually. A brief attack would be 5 seconds, whack on the nose and away. That revelation really probably was the catalyst for us solving the entire case.
Myself, Clive, and our exhibits officer went down to LGC of Forensics, and sat round the table were the heads of the disciplines of forensic science. So someone from hairs, someone from DNA, someone from fibres. They'd all been supplied the statements, they'd all had a look at stuff. But when you're reading stuff dry from many years ago, the statements aren't written like a novel. They're not written to be exciting. They're written to be very factual. And when we finished the meeting and discussed what we, how we would go forward, Clive and I had a bit of a discussion around, well, what can we do to actually liven up the room?
I decided that I had to recreate the attack so exact that I went out and trawled the Metropolitan Police Service and found a young man. He was the same weight, he was the same height, and bless his heart, he's a hero. We reenacted it over about 2.5 to 3 hours, every possible conceivable way that attack could have happened. And then we went back to LGC Forensics, because they had been told it's a brief attack, almost to say, look, ignore that, ignore it. It's not safe, it is unsafe. And this is the reason why, and we bored them senseless with thousands of slides of all these different attacks, but emphasising all the time, it could be between 25 and 50 seconds.
I'm Angela Gallop, and I am a forensic scientist, but I was involved in managing the project and making sure that we had the right group of scientists working on it.
I have to say that Angela Gallop straight away went, wow, oh, well, this is, oh, look. And I have to say, from that moment on, they had a far wider view of what they should be doing.
The attack group were out that night looking for another group to attack. They see Stephen and Dwayne, and then they rush across the road, mount the attack. We know from witnesses that there was muffled shouts, there was noises being heard, so we know it wasn't silent. If that's the case, then during shouts, saliva would emanate from the suspect's mouths and end up on Stephen's clothing. That was our number one thought around what we can do that hasn't been done before.
I remember thinking in 1995 that we'd had a good look at the case. Little realising the strides we would take in finding traces to test. The whole way of dealing with samples, it has meant that information can be got from smaller samples, and it's more discriminating, so it can give you more information about where it came from.
What was different, we asked them to do tests that would be exactly the same as if it happened that day.
We were very interested in the list of items that the police had collected from around the scene. And one of these things was a length of scaffolding pole. And we discovered on this pole that there was some paint marks, as there very often is on scaffolding. And so we were very interested to see whether we could find traces of this paint on Stephen's clothing. And while we were looking for paint, we started to notice some textile fibres.
Stephen Lawrence was wearing 5 layers of clothing. He had a vest, he had a polo shirt, he had a jumper, he had a body warmer, and he had a jacket. They then started to look, well, where did these fibres come from? And they worked out that what had happened was it came from Stephen's red polo shirt.
I invented the word sheddability, because there isn't such a word, but I called it sheddability because Stephen's clothing was made up in such a way that it lost a lot of fibres. So Stephen's, if you like, third layer of clothing was everywhere. So if it's going everywhere, it had to be on the outside of his clothing, which means if it's on the outside of his clothing, the opportunities for it going on someone else's clothing is very high.
That's the first breakthrough that was found.
Within 3 weeks, the scientist phoned me up and said, do you know what? I found all these red fibres. Thousands of them.
We had found 2 different kinds of red fibres on one of the suspects, who was Gary Dobson, on an item of his clothing.
I put it to you that you were one of the 5 responsible for Stephen Lawrence's murder.
But that's your opinion.
I put it to you that you were one of the 5. Did you kill Stephen Lawrence?
No, I did not.
If these fibres had come from Stephen, this was evidence going in the other direction, going from Stephen's clothing to the suspect's clothing. Then we should be looking at other items of Stephen's clothing as potential sources of fibres on suspect's clothing. And so we then just widened our search to include, for example, his trousers. Stephen's trousers were a sort of green-coloured elephant cord, which shed its constituent fibres very readily. And we found some of these fibres on an item of David Norris's clothing.
I suggest to you that your memory lapse was really because you knew you were guilty. That was why you didn't say anything.
That's fair enough. You're entitled to your opinion. And 99% of this country, in my opinion, believe the same thing, Martin.
Well, what alternative
as long as I know
have they
in my
got?
heart the truth, that's all that counts, in my opinion. That's all that counts for me.
When they were shining the light on these fibres, one of the scientists noticed that there has been blood on this fibre, but over the years it has fallen off, but it's left some of its invisible properties behind on the fibre. But where's the blood?
Well, we've looked at the surface debris taken from the suspect's clothing, but shall we go back and have a look in the bags, the original packaging in which the clothing had been sealed? And so we started collecting the debris from inside the original packaging. And we found at least one more fibre of interest doing that. But much more importantly, we found a fragment of Stephen's blood. And running through the fragment of blood, encased in it, were 2 other fibres, both of the same type. And so now we've got this fragment of Stephen's blood in the packaging, and we, it can't just have turned up there on its own.
I was actually at the 15th anniversary of Stephen's death at St Martin's in the Field. All the King's horses and all the King's men. There was David Cameron, there was Mrs Smith, the Home Secretary, there was Brown, who was the Prime Minister. I was sitting right behind him. He'd probably never forgive me for the way I sang into his ear. So there was this whole group of people who were very influential people, and I remember Peter Birdsall, Birdie, he said, Governor, you've got to phone Ed Jarman, who is the most wonderful scientist, really, Mr Jarman. So there was a free kick wall of dignitaries, you know, having their photograph taken with Baroness Lawrence. And there was a massive poster of young Stephen, and I was literally looking straight at him when I spoke to Ed Jarman, who said to me that they'd found Stephen's blood on Gary Dobson's jacket. And I did think to myself, well, Steve, mate, it ain't going to be long now. Because I did, because that's what I thought, you know, it ain't going to be long. And I remember going out and speaking to Cressida Dick, who's now a commissioner, and I'm sure she'd hate me for saying this, but she's quite petite. And I leant down and in her ear and whispered that, and she said, oh, gosh. It's like one of those magical moments, isn't it? Gosh. And this was the one time I thought, do you know what? We could give the family something.
I had my suspicious, because we've been told so many things, and it's like I won't believe anything until it happens. You know, and I suppose I didn't want to get my hopes up, and I didn't want to allow myself to be in that position, because I allowed myself to be in that position before.
I'm Alison Saunders, I'm the Director of Public Prosecutions, and I was the reviewing lawyer in the prosecution of Gary Dobson and David Norris. This was such an iconic case. If there was to be any subsequent prosecution, we had to make sure that this was really something that we had gone into in as much detail as we could, covered every angle that we could, and that we would get it right. We sat down with the scientists and sort of went through all the theories about why was it missed before, why was it there now, could it have got there by other means? So I suppose we were thinking, is this really too good to be true? Can it stand up in court?
What I didn't want to do was another disappointment for the family. Well, I would never forgive myself for it. So it was about making sure we dotted the I's, crossed the T's every time, 5 times, 10 times, but making sure we really drilled into that evidence to ensure that it was safe, not only for the family, but for the court, for defence, for prosecution, for the Crown Prosecution Service.
We met with Mrs. Lawrence and Mr. Lawrence with their legal representatives as well. We couldn't tell them the detail because what we didn't want to do is we wanted to be realistic and we wanted to sort of keep them informed, but at the same time, we didn't want to give them too much information and a false hope. So it was quite a delicate balance.
Clive was telling me, I'm about to do something and I just wanted to let you know. And so I didn't know which of the individuals that was going to be arrested at the time. So I think it gives you information, but it doesn't always tell you every single thing.
We knew where Mr. Dobson was because Mr. Dobson had been convicted of a drugs conviction. I think he got 3.5 years for it. He was actually serving a prison sentence in Belmarsh. We arrested Gary Dobson. We knew David Norris was in a pub in southeast London. And David Norris, I think, is someone who knows how to speak to police because he was chatting like somehow we were mates. But I'm not your mate. I think he probably thought, like Mr. Dobson thought, oh, here we go. Here we go again, you know, same old, same old. But, you know, it was different, wasn't it?
I would like you to tell me how Stephen Lawrence's hair is on the jeans seized from your bedroom.
No comment.
Is there an innocent explanation for how this hair has appeared on those jeans?
No comment.
Trial of the year, trial of the decades, trial of the century. They had to have a breakout room for the media, and if you wanted to get into the courtroom, you had to be there early.
Gary Dobson did it, okay? We proved it as well.
My name is Alison Morgan, and I was junior counsel for the prosecution. By the time we were at trial, of course, Mr. Dobson had been joined in the dock by Mr. Norris, so it was a joint trial. The gang always came as a group, but we were very much inclined that what this should be was a cold, hard forensic look at what the evidence was capable of demonstrating. So although We knew that what the family would want was for all of those people that they had suspected of being involved in the offence to be put on trial. We had to be objective, we had to be impartial about it and look at what the evidence demonstrated.
Considering that they were 16, 17 when they committed the crime, and these guys would have been in what, their 30s now, early 30s, they looked really old.
The enduring image of David Norris I have in my head is the still taken at the Macpherson inquiry. The snarling, teeth-bared, angry face that he had. That was not the image that was presented in court. Gone entirely was the swagger he and Dobson had portrayed. They were diminished, for sure, but still, they gave evidence in their own defence. Maybe somewhere they thought that's all it would take if they were to stand up and answer questions.
The defence attacked the forensic because that was the new and compelling evidence, either that it must be somehow contaminated over the years that it had been kept, or that it was sort of somehow it wasn't direct transmission, because particularly the blood on Dobson's jacket was in a really strange place.
When you stab someone, your hand is, on the one hand, involved with stabbing, and on the other hand is withdrawing the knife. And what you can get is blood going down the back of someone's clothing. So finding a small spot inside the back of the neck of an assailant's clothing is not at all surprising.
A key moment in the trial was when the judge decided that the prosecution could show the famous surveillance tape.
They'll take one of them, skin the black alive. She torture him, set him alive. I'd be trusting himself when he killed himself. So blow their 2 legs and arms on the same one.
Once we got to the point where we'd established the scientific evidence, we'd established the continuity of the exhibits, and we demonstrated who those defendants really were in 1994 when they were 16, 17, 18 years old, it was very difficult for them to then go into the witness box and re-establish their credibility as people who would never have been involved in an attack of this nature.
Giving evidence at the Old Bailey was very emotional. I could see for other people in the court and the jury members, it was quite upsetting when I explained how it all was in great detail.
Even though you know what had happened to Stephen, and having to sit and listen to it again about some of his wounds that he had, I think I probably shut down in some of the cases I didn't want to hear. But at the same time, I didn't want to leave the room. I didn't want to walk out of the room. Having the press so close, you just couldn't, at least I felt I couldn't show any emotions. Even when I was getting really angry and anxious, I couldn't show that.
During the trial, both defendants called their mothers to try and establish their alibi at the relevant time.
Although she couldn't remember a year ago,
yes,
she actually can remember now.
Yes, because I asked her the same question and she said to me, she's been trying and trying and trying for so many years to think, and the only possible explanation she could think is that I was round McGilvran's, and that's where I think I was.
Gary Dobson says that he was round the A courts, as I remember. The reason he was round there, he was taking a CD back to them, and the CD was a Bob Marley CD. He was basically saying, you know, I'm not racist because I listen to reggae music.
I remember thinking, when I heard the full extent of the prosecution case, is that it? And I guess there was a worry that it was, in some regards, maybe a bit thin.
You just set about to do the best job that you can do with the evidence that you have, present that as well as you can, and that's really all that you can do. Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. Almost 19 years after Stephen Lawrence was stabbed to death in South London, 2 men have finally been jailed for his murder. In front of a packed courtroom, Gary Dobson was sentenced to at least 15 years in jail and David Norris to at least 14 years behind bars.
When the verdict came through, not just in the Met, but in police stations around the country, people told me there was cheering. You know, people saw that as a great moment.
Even when it was announced that they were guilty, you know, inside of you, you wanted to shout out, like yes, you know, at long last. But I felt like I was restricted in how I can behave.
Despite these verdicts, today is not a cause for celebration. How can I celebrate when my son lies buried?
I think for the first time in years, there was a smile on my face. At last, some kind of redress about the fact that these racists had killed somebody and been boasting for years and living their own life, having kids.
After the defendants had left the dock, DCI Driscoll was brought up into the witness box.
I thought I was going to get told off, actually. I thought, oh, cool, what have I done here? And I went up in the box and he gave me a judge's commendation, and the team a judge's commendation. He said some very kind words about what we'd done, but he did say those immortal words, which I suppose I'll paraphrase him. Well, OK, don't rest on your laurels. There's some more out there. Go and get them.
Through his work, we've got 2. And there's all the other individuals still to be charged. And I believed at the time that we probably would get, I don't know, 1 or 2 others, I don't know. But I believe that we probably would with Clive in charge.
The following day, Mr. Lawrence's legal representative come up to me and said, "Did you celebrate last night?" And I said, "No, we went and had a quiet Indian curry," to which she said the immortal words, "Did you do that to show you're not racist?" And I said, "Yeah, we put on a Bob Marley record as well." If it hadn't been for Clive, we still would have been here today talking about the same, where Stephen's killers are walking the streets.
The other people involved in the murder of Stephen Lawrence should not rest easily in their beds. We are still investigating this case. And I'd just like to take this opportunity, if anybody out there has any more information or any evidence, even after all this time, please tell us.
Clive Driscoll, along with his team, secured convictions in the longest-running murder saga, most damaging episode in the Met's history. Clive Driscoll turned that around and got those convictions. You would have thought that he would have been lauded within the Met and given whatever he wanted to continue investigating this case. That didn't happen.
The following day, I had one phone call where it was suggested that we'd done enough. In fact, that all of the inquiries had been done and everything, you know, been finalised on Stephen, which I disagreed with.
Once the trial was over, the message I was getting from Clive was completely different.
Why wouldn't the Met want to pursue with that? Why wouldn't they want to carry on? Why wouldn't they have wanted to support Clive Driscoll? Questions only a few people in the Met can answer.
Hearing the crowds, how they were cheering when they heard my name. Sorry. It's walking out, holding it. I think some of the things that's happened, I'll say, like, if my grandmother could see me now. And that's one of those things.
After the 2 suspects are convicted for the murders, and you think that's the end of the Lawrence story, surely more material would come out, new themes would emerge.
I think the most important thing was for us to continue to see Theresa May, which we did, Imran, myself and the Lawrences, because we were saying on their behalf that their belief there was collusion and corruption has not dissipated, and that we wanted investigated. We want another inquiry. Well, in the end, Home Secretary appointed Mark Ellison to see if there was anything in the materials we were giving them. And of course, there was. Only it's much bigger than Lawrence.
I'd asked Mark Ellison to look at the question of potential police corruption, whether any allegations had been looked into and had been properly reported to the Macpherson report.
Ellison said that based on Neil Putnam's testimony, there was reasonable cause to suspect that John Davidson was corrupt.
During the course of the review, it became obvious that there had been a significant failing in understanding how these corruption issues might have impacted on the investigation. What we never got to was a smoking gun demonstrating exactly how. As time went on, it became harder and harder to know whether we could reach any definite conclusions as to the facts, given the absences in the records. And that also raised question marks about whether or not the absences in the records were part of some deliberate absence because the records had been disposed of. There was something more to all of this than perhaps had been thought previously.
Once Mark Ellison had started his work, an individual came forward and said that he had been required as an undercover officer to go into one of the groups that was alongside the Lawrence family.
Peter Francis, old alias Pete Black, the man whose account earlier this year of life undercover proved politically explosive.
I was asked, could I find out anything that could be used to maybe get the public to not have as much sympathy for the Stephen Lawrence campaign as in what it truly had.
It was as a result of that our terms of reference were broadened to look at undercover policing. Whilst it was clear that Peter Francis had got close to the Lawrence campaign, the Metropolitan Police denied that there had been any tasking to undermine the campaign, and records just simply didn't exist for us to reach a conclusion one way or another. The police had in mind a wider public interest, but the reality was that they were spying on victims of crime.
The report was profoundly shocking. Allegations of corruption in the Metropolitan Police. He said they'd been inadequately investigated. Macpherson report, it was supposed to have been able to look at everything. It couldn't because the information wasn't given to it. And a real concern about undercover policing and that undercover police had been able to give the Metropolitan Police information about the family and how they were approaching the inquiry.
Whenever you start talking about this case, some of the things that these people do is unforgivable and not in line in finding justice for us.
Given the gravity of what has now been uncovered, I have decided that a public inquiry, led by a judge, is necessary to investigate undercover policing and the operation of the SDS. There was a concern that in some quarters there were perhaps police officers who in some sense felt they were above the law and that in a sense they didn't have to operate to the same sort of rules as everybody else. And being a police officer is a hugely important job and people need to have confidence in the police. And talking to Doreen, it was quite obvious that that confidence had gone. She had no confidence in what they'd done.
We as a family had to go through all this, and still there's more to come out.
I don't think we'd ever get to the bottom of corruption. The justice system would never allow those things to be investigated in a way in which you could get to the truth.
The Met is a completely different organisation from the one it was when Stephen was killed. You know, if somebody suggests to me that I have corruption in my organisation or I have a corrupt person, you know, I will go after that as hard as I can. I think we are infinitely more open now than we were when I joined. And the reason, in large part, why we are so much better is because of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry.
I think that the Stephen Lawrence case did move things forward. I think we have seen changes of attitude in the police, but I think there is still more for us to do.
The police are not a learning organisation, so the things that happened years ago will continue to happen. And we're seeing that today. There is a knife crime epidemic, and there doesn't seem to be the will to tackle it. I feel that we've taken huge steps in some respects, and in others, pigeon steps. But we needed some form of justice to show that it can be done.
Doreen's struggle for justice did not just help the black community, it helped all communities. It made policing better for not just the black communities, but for everybody.
If you look at what it's done to Baroness Lawrence and Neville Lawrence and Mr. Brooks, if you look what it's done to the Metropolitan Police Service, there's been a lot of casualties. The most awful casualty is Stephen Lawrence.
What's amazing is the legacy that he has left behind. He's a part of our nation's history. There's the England before Stephen, and there's the England after Stephen.
Because of my religious background, I have forgiven them for what they have done. These racists who killed my son, because I couldn't go on with the rest of my life feeling anger about something which has destroyed my way of living, has destroyed my marriage, and caused me not to be able to live where my kids and grandkids are. So I had to forgive them.
Doreen had borne the brunt of this campaign to bring our son's killers to justice, and we know there was at least 5 boys who were part of the gang of boys who killed Stephen. 2 have been convicted, and I wondered whether that would be enough for Doreen to let her just try and get on with her life.
I always think a lot of positive things have come out of it. But still, if I could change it, I'd give anything just to be back to where we were back in '93 before he died. I don't think any of these things really... I don't think any of these things really matters. I think for what I've lost, it doesn't compare. Can we stop now, please?